Welcome to my channel. My name is Ed Faber and I am the chess librarian. Lesson 7 is about checkmate against the lone king. We will look at some basic checkmates to understand how to checkmate a lone king. When one player has only a king remaining on the board, the king is known as a lone king. We will learn the ladder checkmate, checkmate with a queen and a king, and checkmate with a rook and king. You can also checkmate a lone king with the two bishops or a bishop and a knight. If you are new to chess, I would advise to go back to my basic beginners lesson 1 through 6. I am donating money to the Cancer Association and to St. Jude's Hospital if any money is made on this channel. Remember, no one ever won a game by resigning. Let's continue our journey. Ladder checkmate. This is the basic position for the ladder checkmate. Black is in check. He cannot capture the checking rook. He cannot block the check. And he cannot move his king anywhere without remaining in check. The ladder checkmate involving using either a queen and a rook, two rooks, or two queens to checkmate the opponent's king. Let's see how a queen and rook are able to use the ladder checkmate to checkmate a lone king. Diagram is the basic idea of a ladder checkmate is to push the king to the edge of the board. We cut off the king's movement one file at a time with either the queen or the rook, and then use the other piece to check the king so it is pushed closer to the edge of the board. Rook c2 check. We are trying to push the king to the h file. The b file is already cut off by the queen, so giving black's king a check with the rook forces it to move to the d file. King d4. The king is cut off from the c file by the rook, so we use the queen to check it, forcing it to move to the e file. Queen d1. The king now has to move to the file e file. King e3. Rook e2. Check. King f4. Queen f1, check. King g3, rook g2, check. King h4, queen h1, checkmate. Most of the time, you have to figure out how you can cut off the king to checkmate it. What is the best move here? Queen h4. Black's king is now cut off from the 4th rank. Queen d8 would have also been a good move, cutting off the king from the d file. King b3. King b3. Now white has to check the black's king with his rook. How can he do that? Rook a3 is a horrible move because black can capture the rook with his king. Rook g1. White brings the rook to the other side of the board. He will play rook g3 next move and continue to push black's king towards the 1st rank. King c3, rook g3, king d2, queen h2 check, king e1, rook g1 check, mate. The king has been forced to the 1st rank and is now checkmated. It is harder to checkmate a lone king with two rooks using the ladder checkmate. Diagram 5. Rooks to c3. Check. King to d4. White has cut off the king from the 3rd rank, but black is attacking the white's rook. Be careful not to lose your rook when you are checkmating with two rooks. Rooks to h3. Black kings remain cut off from the 3rd rank and white saves his rook. King to c4. What should white do now? Rook to g2. White wants to check the black's king, but if he plays rook to b4 check, rook bishop to a2 doesn't make any sense either because the rook will interfere with each other on the h file. Rook to g2 puts the rook far away from the king and black cannot stop. King to d4. Rook to g4 check. King to e5. Rook to h5 check. King to f6. Rook to a4. White again brings his rook far away from black's king. King g6. Rook b5. King f6. Rook a6 check. King e7. Rook b7 check. King d8. Rook a8 checkmate. How do we drive the king to the corner? Simply checking the king does no good. Queen e2 check, king d4, queen d2 check, king e4 gets nowhere. The trick is to keep the queen a knight distance away from the black king. What does this mean? Queen d2, king e5, queen d3. White keeps his queen a knight distance away from the black king. The queen is kept a knight distance away from black's king because this forces the king to move toward the corner. King to e6, queen to d4, king f5, queen e3. White makes sure that he keeps his queen a knight distance away from black's king. The black king is slowly being forced into the corner. While keeping the queen a knight distance away from the opposing king, make sure that you are driving the king to a corner and not back into the center. King to f6, queen to e4, king to f7, queen to e5, king to f8, queen to e6, king to g7, queen to f5, king to g8, queen to f6, king to h7, queen to g5. White has to be very careful here. If he puts his queen a knight distance away from the black king, queen to g6, the position is a stalemate. When opposing king is on h1, a1, a8, or h8, never keep your queen a knight distance away from the king, because doing so would result in a stalemate. Once you reach a position where the opposing king is in the corner and can only move to the two possible squares, it is time to start bringing your king to help with the checkmate. The two possible squares that the king can legally occupy either has to be on the same rank or file. If the white queen is on f6 and the black king is on h7, it only has two possible squares to move between h7 and g8. But white should play queen g5, forcing the black king to move between h7 and h8. Then white can bring the king to help. King to e2, king h8, king to f3, king to h8, king to h7, king to f4, king to h7, king to h8, king to f5, king to f8, king to f6, king to h8, queen to g7, checkmate. This move cuts off the black's king. King d4. King b2. King e4. Rook c3. King d4. This position where all the pieces are on one diagonal is important. White has two choices here, either king c2 or king b3. King c2. King e4. Rook d3. In this position, all the pieces are on the same diagonal again, but this time it is black's move. King e5. King C3. King E4. King C4. This is another important position. The black king is again one diagonal square away from the white rook. As a general rule, when checkmating with a king and rook, try to get your rook one diagonal square away from the opposing king. If your opposing king then uses your king to make a waiting move, forcing the opponent's king to move toward the edge of the board. Always make sure that your own king is defending your rook when it is one diagonal square away from the opponent's king. King to E5. Rook to D4. Again, the rook is one diagonal square away from the black's king. King to E5. King to E6. Rook to D5. King to F6. White cannot play rook to E5 here because he will lose his rook. So what should he do? King to D4. White brings his king close to black's king. This is generally a good idea when checkmating with a rook. King to E6. King E4. King E7. King E5. King F7. Now the white rook is too far away from the action, so white plays rook D6. King E7. King D5. White defends his rook and keeps it one diagonal square away from the black's king. King F7. Rook F E6. King G7. King E5. King H7. King F5. King G7. Rook F6. King H7. Rook G6. King H8. King F6. King H7. King F7. King H8. Now let's pause here. Do you remember how the queen could not be a knight's distance away when the opposing king was on H8, H1, A1, or A8? The rook cannot be a diagonal distance away when the opposing king is on H8, H1, A1, or A8. If A plays rook G7, the position is a stalemate. Another way to remember this rule is that if the opposing king is on A1, don't put your rook on B2. If the opposing king is on A8, don't put your rook on B7. If the opposing king is on H8, don't put your rook on G2. And if the opposing king is on H1, this position is similar to the basic checkmating position that we showed earlier. The white rook checks the black king and prevents it from moving to H7, and the white king prevents the black king from moving to G7 or G8. The most challenging part of checkmating with a rook against a king is knowing whether to bring your king or your rook closer to the opposing king. For example, on move 10, white decided to play king D4 because he felt his king was too far away from the black kings. On move 13, white saw that his king was well placed and that he needed to bring the rook a diagonal square away from the black's king. This checkmate appears challenging but will become much easier with practice. Rook to H6 checkmate. Going through lesson 7, you should know how to checkmate against a lone king using the ladder. checkmate with 2 rooks or 2 queens, or a rook and a queen together. You also learned how to checkmate against a lone king with a king and queen, or with a king and rook. Always be careful of checkmate in these positions. I'll see you next time.